We're looking at that collaboration between other like-minded individuals, seeing a world where we have 100% electric vehicles. We have 100% of energy coming from solar, wind in the United States, and these clean sources of energy where we have the ability to export solar and wind energy across the state and even across countries.
Hello and welcome to the Solar Maverick Podcast, where solar meets entrepreneurship and experience. I'm your host, Benoy Thanjan, so let's get into it. Hi, this is Benoy, your host of the Solar Maverick Podcast. I'm excited in this episode of the podcast to interview David. He is the managing member at YSG Solar, which is a solar developer based in New York City that develops behind-the-meter community solar and utility-scale projects. In 2018, Forbes recognized David's leadership and listed him the 30 under 30 list in the energy sector. David has been involved with community solar development since 2015, with over 20 megawatts of residential community solar of executed projects and a 250 megawatt pipeline of utility and DG solar projects. YSG has executed power purchase agreements in New York with clients such as the New York Military Academy, the New York Botanical Gardens, the City of New York, and many other local municipalities, counties, and towns. This was a really interesting podcast. Some of the interesting points that David mentioned was how to develop a good solar project, what markets in the US that he's focusing on for development and what markets he's not, how the grid should be compensated for energy storage, and the development cycle of a solar project. David was actually on one of our first episodes of the podcast, episode 9, which was a really great interview. It's called How David Started His Solar Company with David from YSG Solar. We'll also have that in the notes of the podcast as well. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Solar Maverick Podcast. Let's get into it. Hi, this is Benoy, your host of the Solar Maverick Podcast. I'm excited to have David Magid, who's the founder and managing partner of YSG Solar. David, welcome to the podcast.
Benoy, how's it going?
Good. I'm so excited to have you because when we first did our interview, that was episode 9. And now as taping this interview, there's been 111 episodes. I'm glad that we were able to get you on the podcast. I thought that first interview was pretty amazing to learn about your story and how you started YSG. And now we're focused on more of the development and how to develop a good project, markets to focus on, and energy storage. So I appreciate you making the time.
Yeah, no, I'm super excited. And just as we were talking a few moments ago, I can't believe how much great content you have literally put out since we have spoken last on this amazing podcast. So, really super excited to chat with you today. And, like you always say, super excited to just get into it.
For sure. That's how we start the podcast. I'm excited that Dave said it instead of me, which is great. And if you haven't listened to it, you definitely should check out episode 9 of the Solar Maverick Podcast with David. You really learn how he got interested in solar and how he started his company and even the many pivots that you had, specifically with energy efficiency, how when you were actually in college, that's where you learned about solar. You were helping another company start their solar group.
Yeah.
And then you're also a top 30 under 30, right?
Yeah,
Forbes
no,
Energy.
It's definitely, it's always a roller coaster, still to this day, it's always fun. At the same time, I think folks like us, we're always looking to push to the next level, always looking to expand on a personal level, professional level. And for our organizations, folks like us just don't get bored. It's not in our DNA. And so with that, always comes that persistence and those ups and downs. So, definitely always enjoy that.
It would be interesting if you could talk about persistence, because I noticed just from working with you for a very long time, you're always trying to learn about everything and anything, and you're involved in so many different things, even within your own company. Can you talk about how you have that persistence or, just to learn and to be, on top of your game? And
no, it's actually so funny that you brought that up. I would, if anybody were to ask me, what the absolute most important traits were, I actually would put persistence on, seriously, no joke, my top 5 traits, that are absolutely crucial to any type of success. At the same time, obviously it's easy to talk about persistence, but persistence in my eyes, the way I look at it is working for something for such a constant duration of time and be able to not be distraught, from that sense of failure and just kind of understanding that that's just the nature of the beast. Failure is going to come and, be able to accept that, understand that, and that's just part of the path, not giving up at all. It's just not an option for regardless of what you're doing. Sometimes it could be a strength, sometimes it could be a weakness too, because sometimes there is certainly times to stop and to give up. So I feel like it's certainly a balancing act, is what I've learned actually past couple of years too. It's certainly not always about being too persistent, but yeah, I think that's just a crucial item and not an easy component, but it's something that we even at YSG at our firm, we just always try to engrave with everyone, whether it's originating a power contract or a deal. The deal starts, when the other individual says no. That's actually when the negotiations start, when you're able to understand the negotiation points and where lines are drawn and where they're not. That was really interesting.
Yeah, I appreciate you explaining that because that's key. Like persistence is obviously a strong quality to have and to be successful in what you've seen, but sometimes persistence can be negative and failure is a part of life, and moving from failure to failure and continuing to have a positive outlook and move forward is huge. And that's great.
That's always the struggle, right? Is once you start to be in a situation and you're constantly dealing with those failures, nonstop, trickling, especially after kind of pushing forward in our business and many other businesses too. You have such long life cycles going into project development. You could be working on, originating a solar project, executing power contracts, investing all of this money, time and energy and resources into a project just to find out that something changes, policies change, something shifts, and now your project is dead in the water. And you just really need to be able to accept that and to, literally just move forward and push past that.
That's so important as a project developer, being patient, being smart, and, there'll be failure along the way, but to move forward.
I think that's such a crucial component, just looking at the project development business as a whole for the listeners that are familiar and not familiar, with the project development business, but really what we're referring to, the business that's involved, with typically acquiring real estate site control rights, either through, large acreage parcels of land or large square footage of a rooftop, entering into some sort of lease agreement or purchase agreement to construct a solar facility, and then enter into a sale to sell the electrons that are being generated from that solar facility. So that's the project development business, just to explain to anybody that may not be familiar.
Can you also talk about YSG Solar in more depth?
So YSG was established in 2010, and our background, YSG, our strengths are very focused on energy policy, energy markets, and working as a developer, looking at opportunities and finding ways to collaborate both with municipalities, corporations, and really providing them solutions, such as clean energy through these power purchase agreements, and providing them methods to reduce their carbon footprint, align with their ESG and environmental goals, and also provide economic savings. So that's kind of one facet, is working, on that aspect and actual selling and marketing of the power contracts. And the project development, aspect of this, which definitely aligns very closely, which is a piece of that puzzle, involves, YSG going out and acquiring land, entering into these lease contracts, and then working with local municipalities, going through the entitlement process, securing all of the site control permits and approvals, licenses to actually build a solar generating facility, whether that solar facility is, 10 acres of lands or whether that's 100 acres, and, getting a project from a point where it's a vacant piece of land, where it's nothing, to the point where it's a project where there's agreements put in place to actually construct solar facility. Those are just some of the products and services that YSG as a group really offers. And certainly at the same time, we've, as a background, as a group, have always looked at energy policy and understanding really unique attributes about a project. And that's really what got us interested and what gets us interested in a market versus just, hey, there's a piece of land, let's go try to do something. We're really looking for something where there's an edge and something that really stands out.
So is that one of the primary ways that you differentiate from other solar developers?
I would say I think that's probably the biggest reason, and just to kind of give an example, something in 2021 we've been working on is we built up, our GIS team and went through a pretty, significant exercise of really developing some interesting data points from a lot of the prior projects, that we've been involved in, have worked in, or have been able to gather data from, whether that data was from FERC, which is a federal agency, or from some state agencies. And we've been able to take all these data data points and, really put together a system to find the most optimal opportunities to develop a solar facility. Just to give you an example, right now, Benoy and I are, sitting in the middle of New York City and Manhattan. And in New York State, currently, we've been dealing with community solar since it opened up 2015. So, geez, it's been some time. The market's definitely saturated at this point. But the amount we did an analysis with the state of New York, and we basically took all of the data on the electrical lines, understanding where there's capacity on the power lines, the substations. We also took all of the zoning laws. So we took that data. So we understood, hey, these parcels, there's an entry point on the electrical grid. Then what we did was we went and looked at, all right, what's the zoning? Do they have an established zoning law? Is there a moratorium where basically there's a ban, for lack of better words? So then we filtered it further. We read through the laws, tried to standardize all those laws just kind of in a table and identify which property had proper zoning laws. Then we took another step and looked at the property taxes, which properties have a precedent of low property taxes. They're not going to be trying to charge an arm and a leg. And those are three of the big items, that we've looked at, aside from topography and environmental wetland issues, that we really looked at to kind of analyze how many sites, prime sites in New York State, they're currently available. And the total number was there was only about 900 properties in the entire state of New York that can accommodate a 5 megawatt project. They all have reasonable property taxes, and the town allows solar as an allowed use and fits the rest of the criteria.
Yeah, that's pretty innovative to go into that level of detail to find like the ideal site before you actually interact with the landowner.
Yeah. So that's kind of the concept, is really just gathering all that data, finding the absolute perfect site, literally exactly what we want. I was hoping that number to be a little bit larger.
For sure. No, definitely 900 is low.
But yeah, 900 is the number. I mean, that's the number we know. We've looked at every single property, every single parcel. We studied it. Took a long time, a lot longer than I personally wanted it to take. At the same time, when you get onto some of this data on a very granular level like this, dealing with municipalities can get very intricate to have accurate data sources, and especially as properties get transferred to new ownership, and also understanding what data may not be accurate and things along those lines. But that's just an interesting kind of highlight, to kind of understand and just see how we look at project development, especially in the early stage. And we kind of define that as our market research process.
Sure. That's really helpful to understand the market research process. Can you talk briefly, maybe the steps related to project development? You talked about, obviously, your market research. You find an ideal land site.
Yeah, no, certainly. So market research, and that market research, activity will change depending on where we are, what market, we're looking at. As an example, we were talking a bit about New Jersey. Our activities in New Jersey are going to be a little bit different. In New Jersey, for an example, YSG has an individual on our team with a lot of experience with landfills and has worked at a lot of environmental agencies for 20 plus years. So in New Jersey, we've focused more on landfills and really looked at the policy of what are these regulatory, folks looking for, and really trying to take what that regulatory policy is, that blueprint, where the incentives and where the market is, what they're looking to attract, and take that recipe and then look at these GIS and all these other data sources and compile, that target profile of these are the people that we want to market. So that's the step one, the market research. But like we just talked about, it's going to vary. It's not, a fluid process from every single state. Developing solar in Arkansas, which we'll talk about in a little bit, is a little different, than New York State. So after our market research, like you said, then our next process is either the land acquisition or it could be power acquisition. So some markets, you don't have the ability to just put solar panels in a field and move those electrons over the electrical grid to another party. The solar equipment needs to be right on the same premises of the actual energy buyer, that corporation, that industrial facility, manufacturing facility, or whoever that buyer of that electricity is. So that's the second step, is the acquisition process, whether we're acquiring a contract to sell the power or acquiring a lease agreement or a purchase agreement to buy that land or secure those rights. once after we go through that process, and we constantly do this, it's just another refining process of looking back at all the economics, all the assumptions of the project and what type of assumptions, we can assume, and making sure that as a business, this project is going to make sense for us to market. So that process is kind of slowly going through there. And then we also have, various different checkpoints where we're constantly just all huddling up as a team and as a committee and looking at that project to make sure, we understand all of those risks associated with that project, and we know how we can mitigate and manage all of those risks associated, with the development of the project, because, project development can be a very, pricey endeavor, and it's very easy to lose money. So yeah, I would kind of define that as that second stage right there.
You'll do the environmental and geotechnical.
Yeah.
There'll also be town permitting.
That's like the next step too. So after we've gone through our, what we call our project acceptance, we brought this project, we do our initial screening, and we determine as a committee that this project is good. We're going to invest money into this project. Then what we would do next is actually start the development process. Development process is the fun stuff. That's the process where you're able to engage with consultants. You're able to identify parties who you want to work with, to, like you alluded to, whether it's doing these geotechnical analysis, which is studying the soil to understand, how the foundation of these solar systems are going to be built, to building out layouts, how the equipment's going to get done, to working with the electric companies to understand how this system is going to get connected to the grid, what the costs are going to be, understanding a list of all the permits that are involved with the project, everything from an access driveway permit to a special use permit from the local municipality. So understanding all of those items that are involved there are a very interesting process. That process, the development cycle, usually takes anywhere from 6 to 9 months, depending on the size, of the project and the intricacies involved with it.
That's really helpful to understand that. And I think one of the things that you mentioned, a lot of developers lose a lot of money pretty quickly about how risky it is. And, that you're doing all this sort of due diligence to determine, or business case, right, to determine whether it makes sense, because this is obviously at-risk capital that you could lose all of it very shortly.
Yeah. I mean, that's the big item that you and I always speak about this. When you look at development capital, development capital is a very tricky item. In my opinion, development capital is that part of the capital stack that is really, nobody has really solved that to a T. When you look at the funds that are used to actually finance or pay for all of these development costs, typically a developer like YSG, other groups like us will go through the exercise of, utilizing our own balance sheet to pay for these expenditures, or go through the exercise of entering into some sort of joint, venture or some sort of partnership with other parties to mitigate that risk and spread it along to co-develop. So that's been fairly typical compared to other parts of the solar project where sponsor equity, once that project is at NTP, shovel ready, for lack of better words, the risks are fairly, mitigated, and, really aside from some sort of, black swan event, project is going to get built. So getting financing to finance the construction of the facility and term financing, whether it's a mini perm or however that's going to get set up, those are very fluid markets. I would even say that sponsor equity is certainly obviously a very competitive space. Development capital is just not too many players out there that are really looking at that due to various reasons.
You talked about development capital. You could either put it on your balance sheet, you could partner with an investor, and you kind of share proceeds related to a development fee, or, the developer gets a development fee. Right. And somehow there's some sort of cost attributed to the development capital. Yeah. Or a straight development capital loan, which is usually a double-digit interest rate loan, and it accrues on a monthly basis, which could be very challenging when the development's taking a lot longer. So the cost of capital related to developing that project, if it's not on your balance sheet.
Yeah, and I think that's the key. I mean, you hit the nail on the head right there, right? The key is, to be able to develop this project in such a manner where you're able to manage that risk. So you've turned a piece of land, a vacant piece of land, you've been able to secure all the necessary agreements. You're capable of using that as collateral. You've completed your studies with the local utility where you actually have an interconnection agreement, that you have permits, you have all of these documents that you can actually collateralize collateralize. The beauty of that is once you have collateral, you're able to do a lot, and it provides a lot of value for those projects, and even, enables you to kind of do some of the things that you're mentioning about actually securing debt on a project level, which can certainly be tricky and can be expensive. It's certainly an exercise that should be taken carefully.
Yeah, definitely. That's great advice for the development community to hear, and that people are going through all the time that you're talking about. Can you talk about what makes a good solar project? You kind of talked about it a little bit generally, but it would be great if you could be more specific.
Sure. So, things that we're always looking for from a project is ease of construction. And I'm going to go in just such a random order just because of like the things of how my mind is.
Random order is great.
Yeah, exactly. But first thing I could think about is constructability. Ease of constructability is always ideal. So certainly, I would say it's fairly underrated. Just look at the topography. It's a very simple exercise. Understand to make sure that area is flat. If there's site clearing required, get some quotes on, remove all of those stumps, get everything cleared. Understand exactly what's involved there, all your civil work that has to get done. Constructability is a big item, and constructability can be looked at very easily. It's a very easy thing to do. There's a lot of things that are unknown that I'm not going to be able to know. I have to really take some educated speculations on. That being said, another big item is property taxes. We've had projects that literally have gotten permitted. We've gone through that process and have been ready to build, and then show has been stopped by a local school district that may not be managing their funds properly, and they're looking to charge a solar project a tremendous amount of money. And that's a big thing. When you're getting to local communities and projects are being built, this is nothing particular towards solar, but municipalities are always typically looking at how to generate money. What's in it for me? That always old thing. I think that's a big discussion. At YSG, like right now we're in the process. We have another property that we're working on developing. It's about 100 acres. It's in Con Ed territory. So it's a really nice project. But that site, we actually had a meeting with the municipality, and that site has a property on that site. And then we're not going to use it. We just want the land and things along those lines. But there's different areas and ways if you can collaborate and work together, with those municipalities and find things of what they're looking for and how to work together. I think that's important to do early on. And again, it doesn't cost anything, just a conversation, communicating with them. The biggest item, interconnection, and people tell you this all the time, if you don't have interconnection, you don't have a project, right? So interconnection, on that cycle is really going through the exercise of understanding how close your project is to the electrical feeder, whether it's a distributed generation project, you'd be connecting to a 3-phase power line. Typically, if it's in excess of 1 megawatt, you want to connect to a 12 kV power line between 12 and 32 kV. And if it's a larger facility, you're going to want to look closer towards that 32 kV up. And really that benchmark, for the power lines is about 69 kV, pretty much what we call sub-transmission. Anything above that is a transmission, project, which I would consider utility scale. So how close are you to that wire? How close are you to the substation? Rule of thumb has always been 2 miles, but ideally you start the substation, work your way out. That's always key. Make sure there's no environmental issues, endangered species, things along those lines, archaeological items on the site. Again, all items you could screen, pretty quickly. Take a look at your site, make sure you have a clean title. There's no delinquencies that are going to prevent you from securing your title insurance. And probably one of the biggest items you look at, Benoy, is the power contract.
Yeah, for sure.
What's the revenue side? How are these individuals, these investors, these sponsors, how are they going to make their money? So what type of power contracts do we have? What is the term of this agreement? And what are the conditions? What's the credit profile of the individual buying that power? The better the credit profile, terms, and getting into those items, we take all of that information I just talked about, and all of that information is going to get translated into the economic business case. We take all of that, and now we look at our IRR. What is our IRR? Because it doesn't matter if you're selling a power contract to Amazon, your project looks great. If your IRR is not looking good, there's a great chance your project is never going to see the light of day.
For sure. And you know how difficult that is. There's so many different factors and things are moving so quickly. So
No, there really is. And, I think it's such an interesting trend. And, at the same time, right now with the conditions, financial markets, and the fact that there's so much money that is out there looking to be deployed, the fact that solar is such a proven technology at this point, and the profile looks more and more like some sort of fixed income asset than anything else, or has been treated like that. There's the returns certainly, have decreased in the last few years, which has caused a lot of new players to enter the market looking at purchasing projects.
Yeah, for sure. There's so many great points that you made. And really, that's a great summary of what makes a good project and financeability of the project and how that's important, how much capital is coming into the industry. People are getting comfortable, and it's more like an annuity type of investment where the IRR.
No, and I think kind of just close the loop on that discussion point, really the beautiful item too is if you look at the actual points of development capital and you compare this development capital to other profiles, when you look at the returns, you're seeing returns of, very similar to growth capital, venture capital. When you look at growth capital returns, these double-digit returns and, amazing multiples on your capital that you're receiving from developing in projects, and then you have a risk profile of an infrastructure asset. It's just a beautiful item, and it's amazing to see from a finance perspective to be able to see a product. It could have that feel of a municipal bonds. As an example, you look at New Jersey when you have a T-REC or SREC too. Yeah, exactly. Whatever they're calling it these days. You have these, these guarantees. You're really, underwriting New Jersey's ability to stand behind their policies, right? And then, when you have higher returns, beautiful item. So.
As a leading authority in the solar industry, life gets very busy. In addition to traveling the world as a speaker and for my entrepreneurial ventures, I'm a son, friend, investor, and entrepreneur. And when it comes to delivering a great sounding show for my listeners, I choose Podcast Laundry. All I have to do is record and send, and the rest is done. They do the dirty work of podcasting for me. Yes, social media graphics, quotes, show notes, master editing, and much more. All I have to do is record. So if you're a busy podcaster like me with an engaged audience and want to free up your time to do more of what you love, like going to the gym or spending time with loved ones, go to podcastlaundry.com to schedule your consultation or call 347-871-8273. That's podcastlaundry.com or 347-871-8273.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great way to close the loop. You talked a little bit about markets that you're focusing on. You mentioned New York, New Jersey. Can you talk about what are good markets to develop solar in the US?
Yeah, sure. So I'll talk about some good markets, some markets to kind of stay away from as well too, or just to be cautious about. So I think just kind of summarize, on the Northeast. So I would say Maine was a really amazing project with the net energy billing program. Got a lot of attraction, really amazing tariffs, 16, 17 plus cents per kilowatt hour that projects were receiving, on the distributed generation scale. Lots of utility projects were being awarded in that market as well. Problem that has occurred in Maine is that there was so much activity, that there's more DG projects than energy consumers. So that's a big item to balance out is how much energy is being generated, how much energy is being consumed. If there's not enough people to buy the power, what do you do? That's a very real issue that encountered up in Maine. And the other issue that always piggybacks that is the electrical infrastructure. The electrical infrastructure in Maine could not accommodate, any of these projects. So you actually could not even connect to the electrical grid in SMP territory because of everything that had occurred there. That was just another natural item that piggybacked what occurred in Maine to the point that the utility had ended up going back and adjusting some of the rates for interconnection agreements, which, nobody likes to get.
For sure. No, that's a nightmare.
Yeah. So I think that's something, of a wary item. Interested to see kind of what happens with that market as well. Interesting market, just on the flip side of that, you can look at areas like Maryland, which has a lot of attraction as well. And Benoy, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on the SREC there too, because I know that's always been a big item that has actually always fluctuated with their compliance payments, that have occurred. But I think the fact of some of these pilot programs of community solar, particularly with, BG&E and PEPCO and some of these utilities, that's been a very interesting market, to say the least of that. But just kind of touching on that market, what are your thoughts on the SRECs in Ireland?
So yeah, Maryland's SREC prices are like right now around, I think, $77
Oh, wow. Okay.
for energy year 2021. And the SACP, not to bore people, that's the penalty. It's basically the highest the price could be, is actually going down substantially the next few years. But what Maryland's did was like increase the compliance obligation.
Okay.
So that there's a lot more demand for it. So then that the SRECs will trade near the SACP, meaning a small discount.
Smaller spread, yeah.
But yeah, like Maryland's a great market with the community solar pilot, as you mentioned.
Yes.
You know, the SREC prices are a little bit higher.
Sure.
I feel like
they've crept up.
They've crept up for sure.
Have.
I mean, there were at a certain time, it was only like $20 to $30. So
that's what I was
$77 is actually pretty high for Maryland. And then, you know, you have high residential retail rates.
That's right.
And the cost, hopefully, of construction would be lower than other states. And
so I think Maryland is definitely a market to keep our eyes on. You know, interesting market.
The pilot program.
Exactly. You have markets like Illinois that also just got a nice little refresher. Illinois gave everyone a little bad taste just because the lottery setup of that. A lot of developers looking at developing projects, putting a lot of money at risk. You know, a few folks being awarded that I'm sure were very happy, and then a few others that, you know, are probably not.
Yeah, for sure.
But, you know,
sounds like the New Jersey Community Solar.
Yeah. Oh, man. No, I mean, it's a similar story that you hear a lot with these competitive solicitations, just like anything else. They need to have an edge. So I think that's something to be aware of. We've been tracking a lot with Michigan, you know, right now. So Michigan, a few years ago, there was a lot of these PURPA projects, you know, that had occurred. There was actually a lawsuit that occurred with one developer that I won't name and one of the utilities. And, you know, kind of the settlement that had occurred was that a certain amount of megawatts of PURPA contracts would be awarded. So that was floating around for a good amount and caused a lot of nice contracts to be built in Michigan and starts to build some momentum. That being said, Michigan is definitely looking at community solar programs right now, you know, electrical vehicles, energy storage. So Michigan is definitely a market to watch. You know, Minnesota, I feel like, is a fairly fluid market, you know, although these projects, especially on the DG side, are only about 1 megawatt in capacity. But I think it's the predictability of that is fairly nice. Arkansas, which is an interesting market, you know, so I think Arkansas actually we love, and dealing with Entergy Arkansas, they have an interesting program for essentially aggregated net metering, which is remote net metering. And so their aggregated net metering program allows capacity up to 20 megawatts in capacity, which is actually huge. You know, I don't know any other state that has a net metering policy up to 20 megawatts. I think it's kind of crazy. I think it's great. You know, I think the one item that needs to get solved in that market is the fact that when you have a program where it's remote net metering, the load and the generation need to match. So for me to do a 20 megawatt project, I need to have a buyer who uses 20 megawatts. We have Walmart who has a headquarters there and was very vocal in actually getting this amazing policy enacted in 2019 in Arkansas. You know, they're very vocal in getting this done. But aside from that, you know, and I know there is larger entities out there, you know, I think that is something that they need to adjust from a policy side of it, is really working to have some more leniency and maybe community solar, or just, you know, allow the remote net metering program to take multiple off takers, because their tariff, I think it was 10 or 11 cents.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. So if you have 10 or 11 cents on 20 megawatts, you're set. You know, I don't have to say too much more. You know, you're in a good situation. You have that sizing. Aside from that, Arkansas also did have just an RFP for larger projects as well, you know, that recently occurred on the utility scale side, depending on where it was, whether it was connecting on the SPP, you know, side or whatever market it was going into. Virginia?
Sure, Virginia.
You had a lot of good stuff in Virginia too, aren't you? You're involved.
Yeah, for sure. Looking a lot at Virginia.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on Virginia?
You know, Virginia is a great solar market. It's still actually relatively early.
Yeah.
Really, a lot of it's done through an RFP process.
Yes.
A lot of corporate PPAs are being done, utility scale.
Yep.
Because there are a lot of data centers in Virginia.
And
they're requiring 100% renewables. Also, Virginia, I think, has come out with the community solar program recently, and they're looking into having a REC as well in the future. So definitely, like, Virginia
Yeah, I'm interested to see what happens, what's going to happen in Virginia as well, just because of the political environment
that's right.
as well,
sure.
how everything, what the future of the market is. But I know YSG is actively developing projects in that Dominion territory. We've always had a pretty good outlook on Virginia, and they also have a really interesting energy storage program where, just like many other utilities, the utility is obligated to procure energy storage through their solicitations over the next multiple years. But yeah, lots of interesting stuff. I think that's definitely an area to watch. Let's think about other areas that I feel like Pennsylvania, people have been talking about forever. What's going on with Pennsylvania?
So, Pennsylvania has had like a community solar legislation.
How many
that's
years?
Really been going. It's a long time. I think it's like 2.5 years.
Yeah.
Also, like some proposed changes to the REC program to increase. For some reason, there's still a lot of development in Pennsylvania, but not how much it could be with supportive legislator. But everyone's always talking about Pennsylvania being the next big market.
Yeah, people have been talking about that for a while. I just feel like it's almost even longer that I've been tracking that and just trying to see some sort of movement.
Oh, yeah.
But I remember at one time years ago, it was turning out to be a decent market with the SREC.
Yes.
And then it just got plummeted.
There was an oversupply essentially. Yeah. So many projects got built, which lowered the SREC price. Yeah. Also, Pennsylvania allows out-of-state SRECs to come in. Yeah. But now they've fixed the law where it's only in-state, but it's going to take a certain amount of years
to calibrate
that. Actually, Pennsylvania is like an extremely oversupplied when it comes from a REC perspective, SRECs specifically. So.
Yeah, so I think we have some positions in Pennsylvania. We do see value long-term. The question is when, but we do see value there long-term. New Mexico, I would be careful with. I know a lot of people are just talking, New Mexico, let's go to New Mexico. You got sites there. I'm not really into the New Mexico. A lot that we've seen with the annual capacity, I think is only 200 megawatts, which is not that great.
Yeah, it's very small.
And top of that, if you actually look at some of the interconnection guidelines, that they have, if the electrical lines that you're connecting to, if your generation exceeds 50% of the amount of load that's on that circuit, they actually require you to have a dedicated feeder, which is really expensive. So I think that there is just some technical issues with the way that they're requiring solar DG projects to be interconnected to the grid, which is going to increase costs. A lot of unknowns when people get their studies and be like, oh man, this is expensive. And the fact that the capacity is only 200 megs, but program is still not open right now. It's like in the process of being open, but we would just be really cautious with that. Connecticut, I think Connecticut is a market, that's following a few other trends. They're really just looking at meeting their renewable energy goals through wind. They're looking at that as satisfying a lot of their macro goals. At a micro scale, I think they're more in favor of on-site generation. I know they have a big push for standalone energy storage, but aside from that, their community solar program was not that successful at all. I think maybe 10 projects. I don't even know of that, but it got built. But yeah, I know it's the market. I know bad permitting costs, permitting and siting Connecticut is never an easy item. So I think that's something to be cautious on.
Is YSG involved in energy storage?
Actually, we have. It's funny enough because everyone's talking energy storage these days.
It's the hot new word in solar that's been big for 5 years.
Yeah, it really is. It's the hot. Everyone's in energy storage. At the end of the day, I think, yes, we're definitely interested in energy storage. We are working actively. Actually have an amazing, standalone utility scale project that's under development. Really, amazing project, very large project that we're very excited. But I think with anything else, there's so many different ways those projects can be approached. It's going to be a really interesting market. Obviously, I think we've all heard everyone coming up with that analogy that energy storage is where solar was 10 years ago.
For sure. On pricing. Yeah, definitely.
But at the same time, I think energy storage, there's some certainly big differences. It gets me so excited even thinking about energy storage. I don't know if you saw that recently, that Tesla's been quietly building up some of their trading activities on their power desks, for their energy storage. But there's just so much opportunity, the way that grid is going to operate with the ability to store energy effectively, absolutely amazing.
Yeah, it's a game changer if you think about it.
It really is.
It's a dynamic grid and can control both, consumption and also generation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's
instantaneously.
And I mean, when you look at these lithium ion, these are not designed for long-term storage at all. These are short-term type of components. But the fact of the matter is when you look at wind generation, solar, energy storage, and you comparing all these profiles together, you start to really look more and more like a traditional, conventional fossil fuel power plant that you have there. So it's really interesting. I think there's so many different business models.
Definitely.
So I think that can be tricky, from a business standpoint. It's like, where do you start? Even from a developer, right? Like, what type of the business do you get into? How do you get a project built? How do you get a project financed? Energy storage, right? Imagine doing the due diligence on a storage project like that, like all the items that need to get done. And so look at a revenue profile that's going to support service coverage ratios and all the other metrics that are important to financing these projects. So it's really interesting. I think it certainly requires the proper resources to get implemented.
Yeah, definitely. Those are all great points about energy storage. And the key thing is you can't really right now at least get long-term contracting for the many different revenue sources of the battery, which you were mentioning, which makes it more challenging to do the financing because you were mentioning, obviously for solar, it's a lot easier to, get a long-term contract for the power offtake, but it's a little more
complicated. I would say I think like the easiest item to do and the path of least resistance, especially if you're looking at a financier, or sponsor, investor, whatever you want to call them, someone who's a little more conservative and is really looking for a project that is more of an infrastructure project versus a fund that is really, maybe out of Houston, Texas, looking to speculate. Because I think those are two different types of organizations, right? Infrastructure funds versus, somebody speculating on the power pricing hitting $9,000 a megawatt hour. So I think the safest bet is a tolling agreement, right? Having a nice tolling agreement with the utility off-taker for an extended duration of time. That's what these battery manufacturers and companies are looking at as their lifespan of their equipment of 20 years. That being said, so I think the tolling agreement is probably the more conservative and, more of what I would look at as like utility scale PPA, very traditional versus, a merchant wind project, which could be like your merchant storage project, where you're taking merchant risk, and you're starting to look at forward curves and really speculating.
This has really been an interesting interview. Can you talk about like some trends that you're seeing maybe in solar that our audience would be interested in hearing about outside of obviously like storage and...
Yeah, no, definitely. So I think one point is I would say how educated, even the attorneys negotiating these land lease agreements, have gotten. When I hear our acquisition team saying the attorney wants to know what the wattage of our panels are because they know that industry is moving towards 800 watt panels and they're talking about pricing out a deal on a per megawatt basis versus a per acre basis because they want to make sure their client has all their information to make the right decision, and their client is a farmer in the middle of Illinois. Sure. So when we hear like conversations like that coming from traditional lawyers and the vast experience that they have of negotiating these agreements on behalf of their clients, it's a beautiful thing, right? It's showing the maturity of the market and the fact that these attorneys they know what they're doing, and it's not just they're able to advise their clients. And there is that trend, that is a very accurate statement. We are seeing these modules, the wattage of them really go through the roof. Past couple years ago, you start to see a trend towards the bifacial, which got very popular. Other item that has been going on past couple years already, has been the single axis trackers. I'm actually interested to see if the dual axis trackers will come on next. I think that would be, an interesting kind of play onto that. I think another component that you're starting to see is a lot of projects that are in service, people going back and doing renovations to their solar project.
For sure. That's going to be huge.
Yeah. I thought it was like, renovations. I was like, what do we own, an apartment complex? It just sounded so odd. We're doing some renovations on our project, but no, that's an opportunity to refinance and, again, just some renovations and upgrades and things like that, adjust inverters and, all these different components as technology advances to be able to do this, whether it's smart inverters and things like that. I think those are some interesting trends. Even on the smart inverters, be able to kind of coordinate. I think a real big problem that we're going to have is our electrical grid. Nobody really talks about the electrical grid, be able to interconnect to the grid and be able to have smart inverter technology that can communicate and curtail energy at certain times of the day when it needs to be able to maximize. I think that's been studied more and more by these ERI groups and all these folks that are doing an amazing job studying these these items. That's really great. It's amazing, even traditional commercial industrial off takers, but even on the solar side of it too.
Yeah, these are all a lot of great trends. What we did in the episode 9 of the podcast was talked about like a book recommendation. And I thought it was a really great book. It was actually from Rocky Aoki. It was a really great book. Are there any book suggestions that you have now? I know you read a lot.
Yeah, no, I definitely appreciate that. And it's actually one funny item I will really encourage everyone also to jump onto Audible, or even just YouTube some books, because that's the other item too. Obviously there's such a pleasure in opening up a book and chilling out in a hammock or whatever it is, and literally reading really interesting story. But also definitely encourage anybody who's not utilizing Audible as well. It's another great way that you can kind of rummage through and listen to some amazing content while you're going through your daily commute or in your vehicle traveling. Yeah, but definitely some really interesting books. I would say that come across recently. I think the book we were talking about before I mentioned was Rumsfeld Rules with Donald Rumsfeld. Essentially what he did over there in that book was an interesting concept. Throughout his life, he actually always, documented different rules that he thought were really interesting. And he took all of those rules and basically put them in, for lack of a better words, like a shoebox, wrote them down on notes and put them down there, and then compiled all of these notes and then built his own rule book. And he references where he had that information from as well too.
Wow.
So I thought it was an amazing book. It's a shame. I just right after I actually finished reading that book, and then unfortunately I heard about his passing, but amazing man, amazing legacy. And, I know he was in his 80s. I'm sure he had an amazing, life and family as well too. So I think that was a great book, certainly highly recommended to any of the listeners and folks along that lines. Read an amazing book on the story of McKinsey as well and the firm. It's a really interesting read. It goes into some nice details about the founding of McKinsey and some of their corporate culture, really what has made them stand out as an organization and really building that consulting industry. Consulting was not what consulting is today when they started that sector. They literally made a whole entire business and took, something from traditional accounting principles to business consulting and really combined these both, their market leadership and their corporate culture is just absolutely amazing. So that's a great book. Another great book, Power Broker, great book that talks about Robert Moses. This one actually just recently started, so can't give you too much of insight. But again, another very interesting read. Another man with a great vision who has really some great accomplishments, especially locally. And these are the items you see, just being a local New Yorker, on Long Island, you see the names and you're just, what is that? And you kind of read a little bit more about these folks who just really made a difference and amazing stuff to read. So yeah, those are some really good books, highly recommend everybody checking out.
Yeah, definitely. Those are great suggestions. We'll have it on the notes of the podcast. I appreciate you sharing your book list. I noticed, as we've talked about before, that it's like biographies that you tend to gravitate towards. And I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, no, it's funny that you bring that up. Someone else told me that too. It's actually my barber. He was talking, because I was talking to him about the books too. And he was telling me about, him reading all these nonfiction books. And I was like, I don't know if I'm into that. Cause I'm just not that type of guy. Like last time I played a video game was like NES or like Sega Genesis.
Oh wow, that's a long time.
Yeah, it's I just don't play
PS5
games like that. Yeah,
Yes.
so I just could not get that nonfiction or game type of mentality. But I get it. There's definitely that enjoyment and appreciation of it. He kind of explained to me as well because he's big into some fiction books as well. My ideal books has always been on biographies, really understanding people and really kind of studying that psyche and things along those lines. I always enjoy reading books like that. Also enjoy just reading kind of books on learning different topics, whether it's, engineering or different components that have attracted my interest. Maybe next episode I'll have some some crazy fiction or some wild. I'll have to try to diversify or not. I can be somewhat of a fairly boring in that stage of fairly predictable.
Well, they're all great book suggestions. I can't wait to read it.
No, please do. I hope you do get a chance to check them out, and definitely hope, some folks as well.
Yeah, definitely. That's great advice. This has been an amazing interview on the Solar Maverick podcast. I appreciate your time, David. If people wanted to learn more about you and YSG, what's the best way for them to do that?
Benoy, it's literally always a pleasure catching up.
Yeah, definitely.
I actually, always use your tagline. Let's get into it. I literally think I use that with my wife. I'm like, all right, let's get into it.
It's funny because you always use it actually when we're together in a meeting or on a call. So
yeah.
I'm laughing. He's like, isn't that your tagline?
Yeah, it's your tagline. No, it's a great tagline. It really is. But no, check us out on LinkedIn. So YSG Solar, check out our LinkedIn page. Follow us. You can follow all the amazing stuff that we're doing. We have some really innovative, amazing projects. Our objective is really looking at supporting the transformation of the electrical grid. Our vision as an organization is we're looking to see 100% of the energy come from renewable sources, such as solar, winds, and energy storage. We're looking at that collaboration between other like-minded individuals, seeing a world where we have 100% electric vehicles. We have 100% of energy coming from solar, winds in the United States, and these clean sources of energy where we have the ability to export solar and wind energy across the state and even across countries. We're looking for a world where amazing projects that these can be implemented. YSG is always looking for like-minded talent, people who share that vision and are looking to make those accomplishments and support our organization and other organizations like us. No, thank you so much, Benoy. Look forward to chopping it up again real soon.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this has been very educational. So I appreciate you imparting your wisdom about the best ways to develop. I think our audience will find this very valuable. I've learned a lot from this conversation. And again, thank you. I appreciate you being on, one of the earlier episodes and coming back now, making time for this. So it was really interesting to hear your mission statement as well.
No, thank you. I really appreciate that. And if you have not subscribed, hit the subscribe button. Definitely we're on the 100 and something episode. And, before we know it, we'll be on the 1000th episode, so definitely keep following and keep listening. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the Solar Maverick Podcast. The Solar Maverick Podcast is brought to you by Reneu Energy. We're a solar development and consulting firm. If you believe that this podcast is adding value to you, please give us a 5-star review and share with those that you think could benefit from this information. Please email all questions, suggestions, and feedback to info@reneuenergy.com. That's info@reneuenergy.com. The Solar Maverick Podcast is produced by Podcast Laundry and executive produced by Benoy Thanjan and Kevin Y. Brown.